Picture the scene. There's a killer disease on the streets and it's a race against time to get the population vaccinated. Well, that's exactly what happened in Wales 50 years ago during Britain's last outbreak of smallpox.
If we think about recent scares like SARS, avian flu, swine flu, people were really worried about those. Well, smallpox was what it was like when that happens, when an epidemic gets out into the community.
As the disease gripped the South Wales valleys, usually busy streets became ghost towns. Anyone in contact with the infection was quarantined at home.
One time the street would be full of children, but during that time you wouldn't see a soul in the street.
A team of doctors and nurses spent 2 months trapped in an isolation hospital caring for the victims. Tonight, one of those at the heart of the epidemic breaks her silence for the first time in 50 years.
Being in there, isolated like that for those weeks, it could have gone on and on and on.
Burnt to the ground, Penrhys Isolation Hospital in the Rhondda, which came to symbolise the 1962 smallpox epidemic in South Wales. The disease spread across several towns, claimed 19 lives, and nearly 1 million people were vaccinated in Cardiff and the valleys.
It was so scattered. You know, it wasn't localised, it wasn't as though it was all in one place, it was here, there and everywhere. So we never really knew who was going to be next. This is the letter I received the night I went into Penrhys. There was an emergency occurred up there, and matron had asked for nurses to go up for night duty, and that was the night I went in, February the 26th, 1962.
88-year-old Mary Richards from Pentre in the Rhondda was a nurse experienced in infectious diseases. So when the letter came asking her to go to work in the Penrhys Isolation Hospital to care for smallpox cases, she didn't hesitate. She had an hour and a half's notice to pack a small bag and couldn't take any of her own clothes.
We're in there for 8 weeks. There was the one phone, and that phone was used for emergencies during the day. Then our family had the number to ring, but they had to be ringing by 7 in the night. Then there was no phone calls, no incoming calls, because doctor then, he had to relay all what went on in the day to Cardiff. We all got on all right up there, you know, we were a team, we all looked after one another as best as we could. Doctor used to look after the patients, we did, and then doctor would look after us as well, make sure we were all right.
The disease was first diagnosed in Cardiff in a Pakistani man called Shuka Mir. He'd flown into Britain on January the 13th and taken a train from Birmingham to the city. He was seen by a GP in the flat above this restaurant in the docks. He was confirmed as having smallpox the next day by the late Professor John Pathy, a consultant in infectious diseases.
He clearly had been in contact with people in Birmingham, people on his way back to Cardiff, the taxi driver who took him there, and people actually in where he was staying in Butetown.
Shuka Mir was taken to the remote hilltop isolation hospital at Penrhys. Today, only the high walls remain after the hospital was deliberately burnt down in 1971. Meanwhile, in Cardiff, a mass vaccination programme began. James Stewart produced a documentary for ITV Wales 10 years ago.
They believed that up to 60 people may have had contact with the Pakistani man who came and stayed in the restaurant in Cardiff. But they were also worried about the train that he'd travelled from Birmingham to Cardiff on. Not just people who might have been on the train when he was on it, but on that train going back afterwards and back again and over to Swansea and back again. So they tried to contact hundreds of people who might have been on that train. It was a massive operation, and that was when they were really worried, because they were worried it was going to get out.
James is now a journalism lecturer at the University of Glamorgan in Cardiff. To mark the 50th anniversary, he's running an online project with his students about people's memories of the 1962 outbreak. His website invites people to contribute stories so all generations can learn about a significant part of their heritage.
The idea is to try and make available to as many people as possible the research that I've been able to put together over the last few years about what happened in 1962 in South Wales, because there are a lot of documents about. You can go to the National Archives and see a lot of documents, but nobody's ever really brought this story into one place where people can go and find out more, and they can contribute their own memories and their own stories to it. So that's the idea.
It's important that such an important event that's happened in South Wales is documented, and I think it's kind of bringing it into the 21st century and giving it almost an online museum. I think it's a really, really interesting and really valuable thing that needs to be documented.
We've come close with things like swine flu or bird flu, but I don't think until it actually happens, I don't think any of us can even imagine what it feels like. And that's why, for me, it's difficult to imagine the disease. So the way I look at it from the project is, well, what about the people? How did the people cope?
In 1962, there were 60,000 cases of smallpox across the world, but it's now been eradicated. Remarkably, 50 years ago, there was no outbreak in the Welsh capital, despite Shuka bringing it to Cardiff. But fear was contagious.
There was a panic in Cardiff. People were queuing up for vaccination. People were apparently fighting for vaccine when they thought it was going to run out. Within the period of a few months, they vaccinated nearly 1 million people in South Wales. So even in itself, the vaccination programme was a massive thing. If we think about recent scares like SARS, avian flu, swine flu, people were really worried about those. Well, smallpox was what it was like when that happens, when an epidemic gets out into the community, and nobody is immune to that. Now, obviously, you could be vaccinated, and vaccination was very effective against smallpox, but not everybody had been vaccinated at the time. It affects you all, doesn't it? Old or young, rich or poor. It makes no discrimination, a disease like that. So there was an absolute panic, especially when the first case was discovered in Cardiff. In the files in the National Archive, I found a letter from a woman to George Thomas, who was an MP in the city at the time, complaining that she'd seen a photograph of the Cardiff City football team being vaccinated when she couldn't get vaccine for her little daughter. What's going on? George Thomas took this up with the minister.
John Pathy's role in the smallpox outbreak was not made public until 10 years ago. For 40 years, he kept his involvement secret, not even telling his family. His son remembers being vaccinated.
Well, I can certainly recall as an 11-year-old being lined up with my younger siblings to be vaccinated by my father, undoubtedly with inducements. I think it was probably at my mother's insistence that we were all vaccinated. But I certainly don't recall my father ever mentioning the word smallpox at that time. He couldn't tell his colleagues what he was involved in. He had to get on with his general hospital duties and not mention the word smallpox and his involvement with the epidemic.
I used to have to bring a bag of protective clothing, cap, gown, mask, over boots, waterproof over boots, and I would get out of the car and walk about 10-20 yards to the actual entrance to the hospital.
On several occasions, Professor Pathy's son accompanied him, but all the time not knowing the reason for the hospital visits.
He wanted some company, so he drove us up to Penrhys Isolation Hospital, parked some distance from the hospital, walked to the entrance with his bag of protective clothing, obviously left me in the car.
While Aidan sat in the car waiting for his father to carry out his secretive ward rounds, locked away inside Penrhys Hospital were 12 patients, some of whom were dying. Nurse Mary Richards cared for Shuka Mir, who'd arrived in a foreign land with an apparently worthless smallpox vaccination certificate.
We couldn't converse with him, he couldn't speak any English. And we couldn't speak his language. We were the silent partners, me and him, when I should take him out for his walk. We couldn't. There was nothing we could say, nothing I could tell him.
Mary had to check her patients every hour, taking swabs and putting carbolic lotion on their skin. The staff were covered from top to toe in protective clothing.
Gowns, masks, caps, gloves. And that was every day for 8 weeks.
The smallpox victims were not only dealing with a killer disease, but also completely cut off from their loved ones.
And like I think, in an ordinary hospital, if there's somebody critically ill, the first thing they do is send for the family. No, well, they couldn't do that, so they didn't see anybody.
These declassified documents from the National Archives reveal how the doctors would update authorities in Cardiff and London about Shuka Mir's condition. After 7 o'clock in the evening, the phone line from Penrhys Hospital would often be engaged for hours while officials were informed.
It was a terrible time, anxious time. Because like I said, we never used to know where anybody was coming in from. The incubation period was 10 to 12 days. Then doctor, we'd wait, then we'd hear from Cardiff if there was any cases notified.
For over a month, it seemed the smallpox scare was under control. But then a consultant at East Glamorgan Hospital fell ill. Obstetrician Robert Hodkinson had no contact with Shuka Mir, but had attended a post-mortem of a Rhondda woman who died mysteriously before an operation. The doctor was transferred to Penrhys and nursed by Mary Richards.
I was there the morning he died. He just slipped away. Doctor was going to give him a blood transfusion, and he just went. When they died, we had to soak sheets in the bath of carbolic, and we wrapped the bodies up in sheets. Then they were left in the ward until the day of the funeral.
It was clear that the disease was spreading, so the wards where Mr. Hodkinson had worked at East Glamorgan Hospital were isolated. At one time, 20 women with newborn babies were quarantined.
The day before she was born, was due to be seen by Dr. Hodkinson, as the ward sister told me.
Mary Elaine, seen talking here to a university student for the online project, expected to be home within a few days of having her baby.
We were told that we couldn't go home and we would be allowed no visitors. It wasn't particularly nice. However, there was nothing we could do about it. We were allowed parcels to come in, but obviously we couldn't send anything out. And we were told by the nursing staff that we had to remain in our beds.
Mary and the other mothers and babies ended up being literally locked in the wards for just over 3 weeks. It was hard for Mary's eldest child, who was only 2 at the time. She could only wave to her from the top floor window.
And it was a case of everybody trying to comfort everybody else, Somebody had, when we were allowed into the television room, somebody had had a pack of cards sent in, and a lot of us spent a lot of time playing cards. It was a case of anything to pass the time in between feeding your child or attending to your child.
Meanwhile, outside the hospitals at East Glamorgan and Penrhys, communities were closing in on themselves, wondering who would be hit next.
It was terrifying, of course, because one didn't know how many contacts were being made in a very closely knit community. And so clearly we were worried and concerned that it could be a very big outbreak.
My wife was in hospital with this Dr.
Hodgkinson, who died.
Hodgkinson, and now they're coming to the house now 3-4 times a day to examine her because since she's home. But up to now they're saying she's free from the smallpox.
Well, we are all worried. There's no good saying we're not. But we've got a wonderful sense of humour as Welsh people.
People in the valleys were given a wide berth in Wales and beyond.
The Rhondda district was designated by the World Health Organization as an infected area, and that then meant that anybody from that area couldn't travel around the world. And quite apart from that, there was a lot of evidence of prejudice in other parts of the country. They didn't want people from the Rhondda going to stay in Blackpool. Welsh people travelling to London on trains were speaking in hushed voices so that people didn't hear their Welsh accents. The medical officer of health in Monmouthshire told people to stay away from Cardiff, and that caused a bit of a stink.
It's a difference, but yeah, no boy, to when we had all that trouble up here, remember, when we were younger?
Oh, dear me, frightening, wasn't it?
All those bloody people dying.
Oh, dear me.
You don't know where it come from.
These two men were in the midst of the outbreak in Tegvan in Ferndale, where a lady from number 12 had smallpox. Cliff lived a few doors away and was 18 at the time. Len ended up buying the house that had been infected.
People were frightened. People didn't want to bother with people because they didn't know if somebody was carrying it. But you just got on with normal life. That's the Rhondda people all over. And we just got on with it and helped anybody we could.
When they went up the top of the street then, where the disease was, there was lots of coming and going, activity, rushing here and there, into two houses involved, number 12 and number 13. And it started off with cars. 2 black cars was the beginning. 2 men in black suits in the front. And then there was 2 blokes in the back, again wearing white coats, masks and hats, and really frightening.
Cliff says Tegvan and the surrounding area resembled a ghost town during the epidemic. Some employers sent people home, but Cliff still had to work in a local factory.
You know, we could come home for dinner, hours dinner, not a soul in the street. Go to work 8 o'clock in the morning, not a soul. Come home 4 o'clock in the afternoon, not a soul. Weird, it was weird.
But the worst was yet to come. On April the 6th, 8 patients at Glanrhyd Mental Hospital near Bridgend were diagnosed with smallpox. 1 died that night. Staff had been revaccinated, but hospital records show that only 8 of the 45 women on the ward had been inoculated. Infected patients were transferred to Blackmill Isolation Hospital 4 miles away. 12 patients from Glanrhyd died in a week.
The thoughts were, firstly, how many patients might be dying, because quite a lot of patients did die. And also, how were we going to be absolutely certain that nothing got out of the smallpox hospital to the surrounding community?
To this day, mystery surrounds how the virus spread from the Cardiff case to the valleys and then to Glanrhyd Hospital, though many of their elderly mental health patients and staff had come from the Rhondda. Documents reveal a link between Shuka Mir, the first case, and a teenage girl who visited him.
There's a very interesting thing in the archive which bears out, in a sense, a rumour which has been floating around for almost 50 years. According to one of the documents in the file, a young girl of about 16 from Tontaig visited Shuka Mir, the Pakistani who was ill with smallpox, in the Calcutta restaurant in Cardiff. Whether she might have been the contact, whether she might have been the person or a contact of hers that took it into the valleys is something we'll probably never know. But that was a very interesting thing hidden away in the files there.
I know for a fact that he told us that a person from the Rhondda had visited him and sat on the edge of his bed, in actual fact, talking to him.
For the University of Glamorgan's online project, capturing first-hand memories is crucial to understanding the impact of an epidemic on social history. Even rugby matches were hit.
The match between Wales and Ireland was cancelled that year. The Irish didn't want anybody coming from Wales to Ireland because of the fear of smallpox. It was that big. If you think about how important these rugby matches are now in the life of Wales, that's how much impact it had. So nobody who was alive at that time would have forgotten it. But of course, there'll come a time when there won't be anybody left who'll remember it. And this way, we can collect their stories and create an archive which I think will be of interest to generations to come.
I've never been exposed to any sort of epidemic, and I don't think anyone from my generation really has. We don't know what it's like. And for people to try and understand what it's like for people to be fighting to get a vaccination, I can't fathom that, and I'm really looking forward to finding out what that felt like.
After 8 long weeks confined to Penrhys Hospital, staff were allowed out when there were no more smallpox cases.
We had to burn everything, all the case sheets, everything to do with the patients, burnt all our clothes, like what we weren't using up there, gowns and everything, all burnt.
But before going home, the staff had to be rigorously cleaned and x-rayed.
We had all these different baths with different chemicals in this one, then out in that one, and out in that one. Then into our clothes, marvellous. Then from there, we landed in the chest clinic in Pontypridd, where we were x-rayed and they found something they hadn't seen before on our lungs. Well, we could have told them. It was all the disinfectant we were smelling up in Penrhys.
For Mary, being at the heart of the last smallpox epidemic in Britain has never faded from her memory. She's kept the original letter from the World Health Organisation giving the all clear.
The World Health had notified Cardiff that on May the 28th, 1962, South Wales was eradicated from smallpox.
The number of young people not in education, employment or training has risen faster here in Wales than anywhere else in the UK. But is that just because of the recession? That's Wales This Week, next Tuesday at 7:30.